The man's knife caught the streetlight for half a second before Han Bo-ra swung the umbrella into his wrist with everything she had. He howled, the blades skittering across wet pavement, and Yoon Jae-hyun, still catching his breath from the first blow that had knocked him against the gallery wall, stared at her with something between shock and disbelief as she stood between him and his attacker, the old, battered umbrella gripped like a weapon in both hands. "Run," she said, and he didn't, because running meant leaving her alone with an armed man twice her size, and something in Jae-hyun's chest refused that math completely. Police sirens finally cut through the alley's narrow dark, and the attacker fled, leaving behind a dropped phone, a torn glove, and a name Jae-hyun would spend the following week tracing back to exactly the man he least expected to have sent him. To understand how a stranger's kindness 3 years earlier ended up saving his life in an alley behind his own gallery, we have to go back to a rainy Tuesday when a struggling art student first crossed his path entirely by accident. Han Bo-ra had spent 4 years studying painting at one of Seoul's respected art programs before her family's savings ran out the same semester her final thesis exhibition was due, forcing a choice between finishing her degree and continuing to eat regularly, a choice that had, in practice, made itself. She left school 11 credits short of graduation, the same cruel margin that seemed to define so many lives balanced on the edge of just barely not making it, and spent the 3 years since selling small watercolor prints and hand-painted cards from a folding table near Insadong's crowded weekend market, competing for foot traffic against dozens of other vendors selling similar work at similar desperate margins. It was, on good weeks, enough to cover her tiny studio apartment's rent and the modest amount she still sent home to her mother, recovering slowly from a workplace injury that had left her unable to return to her previous job. On bad weeks, rainy weekends when foot traffic vanished, months when a popular new vendor drew customers away from her usual spot, Bo-ra ate less, sold pieces at a loss just to keep some money moving, and told herself, with the stubborn optimism that had kept her going for 3 years, that the next week would be better. "You paint better than half the artists showing in actual galleries," said Yu Arium, a fellow street vendor, selling handmade jewelry from the table beside Bo-ra's most weekends. And the closest thing Bo-ra had to steady company in a life that left little room for anything else. You should be showing in one of those galleries, not selling watercolors in the rain for people who barely stop to look. "Galleries want connections I don't have, and money I definitely don't have," Bo-ra said, wringing rainwater out of a canvas awning that had started leaking weeks earlier and that she still hadn't found the spare money to replace. "This is what I've got. I'm not going to pretend it's not enough, or I'll never get through another week of it." It was on one of the worst of those rainy weekends, 3 years before the alley confrontation that would upend everything, that a stranger in an expensive coat had stopped at her flooding table, watched her scrambling to protect her paintings from the sudden downpour with nothing but a torn plastic sheet, and, without a word of explanation, handed her his own umbrella before disappearing into the crowd. Bo-ra had called after him, confused, grateful, unsure what to do with a gesture that specific and that quietly generous from a total stranger who clearly had somewhere important to be and had simply briefly decided her flooding paintings mattered more than staying dry himself. She never learned his name that day. She kept the umbrella anyway, repairing its bent spokes twice over the following 3 years rather than replace it, because it had arrived unasked during one of the hardest weeks of her entire post-school life, and something about its quiet, unremarked kindness had stayed with her in a way she couldn't fully explain even to herself. She had no idea that the man who'd handed it to her ran one of Seoul's most respected auction houses, or that beneath its polished galleries and record-setting sales, that business served as the front for a criminal network that moved laundered money through carefully authenticated and, increasingly, carefully forged fine art. Yoon Jae-hyun ran Seoul's most prestigious auction house, a business built across 3 decades by his father before him, into one of the region's most respected authorities on fine art authentication. And, beneath that respected surface, into a sophisticated money laundering operation that used high-value art sales and their notoriously opaque provenance records to move enormous sums for the organization's less legitimate interests. He had built his personal reputation within both the legitimate art world and his own organization on a specific, deliberate practice, quiet, unremembered generosity, offered without expectation of recognition or gratitude, extended to strangers whose circumstances happened to catch his attention on a given day. He gave anonymously to struggling artists' funds. He occasionally, impulsively, helped strangers he encountered in small, specific moments. A stranded commuter, a vendor caught in the rain, and made a deliberate point of never following up, never expecting acknowledgement, treating the kindness itself as the entire transaction rather than the beginning of one that required gratitude to complete it. You could build considerable loyalty by making sure people know exactly how much you've done for them. His longtime advisor, Baek Sung-ho, observed once, only half joking, "Performative generosity buys quite a lot of goodwill in this business." "Performative generosity buys performance," Jae-hyun said. "I've watched enough people in my organization perform gratitude for favors they resented every day since receiving them. I'd rather help quietly and never know whether it mattered to anyone than build an entire network of obligation dressed up as kindness." The philosophy had roots in a betrayal Jae-hyun rarely discussed even with Sung-ho, a longtime business partner years earlier who had, for over a decade, performed loud, visible loyalty and gratitude for every favor Jae-hyun had ever extended him, right up until the day that same partner had quietly, methodically begun selling Jae-hyun's authentication secrets to rival auction houses for considerable profit. The lesson Jae-hyun had taken from it was not that kindness itself was foolish, but that loud, performative loyalty measured nothing real about a person's actual character. No one touches me, helps me, or pays me publicly, because public gratitude and public loyalty have both, in my experience, turned out to be theater. That had become Jae-hyun's private rule. Pride functioning less as armor against vulnerability itself, and more as a careful filter against performances of closeness that rarely proved genuine when tested. He gave away umbrellas, coats, and quiet financial help to strangers with a consistency his own staff rarely noticed. Precisely because he never mentioned it, never expected it remembered, and rarely remembered the specific recipients himself. Once enough time had passed, a rainy Tuesday 3 years earlier, and a struggling artist's flooding table had long since faded into the general, unremarkable category of small kindnesses he extended, without keeping count. He did not yet know that the woman who'd received that particular umbrella had kept it, repaired it twice, and was about to save his life with it in an alley he'd never expected to need saving in at all. The alley confrontation happened on an unremarkable Thursday evening, 3 years after the umbrella first changed hands, when Jae-hyun, leaving his gallery late after a tense meeting with his business partner Cho Young-tae, found himself followed by a man who had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment, of isolated vulnerability. Bo-ra, who had, in the year since receiving the umbrella, occasionally sold her watercolors near the gallery district on evenings when foot traffic from gallery openings ran higher than the regular weekend markets, happened to be packing up her folding table in the same alley when the attack began, close enough to hear the scuffle, to see a man twice her size shove Jae-hyun hard against the gallery's side wall, a blade already drawn. She did not recognize Jae-hyun's face in the dim streetlight. She recognized immediately and without hesitation a person in danger, and moved the way 3 years of navigating unpredictable street vendor evenings had trained her instincts to move, fast, decisive, without pausing to calculate her own safety first. She swung the only weapon within reach, the same umbrella she still carried in her bag on evenings when Seoul's weather looked uncertain, its spokes bent and repaired twice over, its fabric faded but still, stubbornly, functional, into the attacker's wrist with enough force to send the blade skittering across wet pavement. "Run," she said to Jae-hyun, who, still catching his breath from the initial blow, found himself unable to simply abandon the stranger who'd just placed herself between him and an armed attacker on his behalf. The attacker, faced now with 2 people rather than one incapacitated target, and hearing approaching sirens from a police patrol several blocks over that Jae-hyun's own security detail had already summoned the moment his tracking signal registered an unexpected stop in an unsecured location, fled the scene, leaving behind a dropped phone, a torn glove, and, though neither Jae-hyun nor Bo-ra realized its significance yet, a name half visible on a contact saved in the abandoned phone's recent call log. "Are you all right?" Jae-hyun asked, still breathing hard, staring at the woman who'd just risked her own safety for a total stranger. "I should ask you that," Bo-ra said, adrenaline still coursing hard enough that her hands were shaking around the umbrella's handle. "Are you hurt?" Jae-hyun looked at her properly for the first time, the exhausted, wiry strength in how she'd swung the umbrella, the same calm, decisive competence she was showing now in the attack's immediate aftermath, and something in his memory, distant and half-formed, stirred. "This umbrella," he said slowly, studying the familiar, distinctive pattern along its faded fabric, a design he recognized because he'd bought a small batch of them years earlier from a boutique that had since closed. "I think I gave you this years ago." In the rain, near Insadong, Bo-ra's eyes widened. "That was you? Who are you?" Jae-hyun asked, though this time the question carried a very different weight than it had the first time he'd wondered it. 3 years earlier, watching a stranger's flooding table disappear into a crowd he'd never followed up with. In the days following the attack, Jae-hyun insisted, over Bo-ra's initial protests, on both compensating her for the risk she'd taken on his behalf and ensuring her continued safety, given the very real possibility that whoever had sent the attacker might attempt something similar again. "You don't have to look after me, because I happen to be useful in an alley," Bo-ra said, wary of charity in the specific way 3 years of precarious self-sufficiency had trained into her. "I did what anyone should do when they see someone getting attacked." "That's not a debt you need to repay." "It's not a debt," Jae-hyun said. "It's recognition that you put yourself in danger for a stranger, twice now, 3 years apart, without ever once expecting anything for it. That deserves more than a polite thank you and nothing further." He offered her a position, initially framed as security consultation given her demonstrated resourcefulness, though it evolved quickly, once he saw her portfolio, into something considerably more suited to her actual training, cataloging and preliminary authentication work at the gallery, a role that let her finally use her painting education in a professional capacity for the first time since leaving school 3 years earlier. "You're offering me a job because I hit someone with an umbrella," Bo-ra said, half amused, half still disbelieving her own circumstances. "I'm offering you a job because your portfolio shows exactly the kind of careful, technical eye my authentication team needs. And because the alley happened to prove you're also someone I trust completely under pressure," Jae-hyun said. "Those aren't the same reason, even if they arrived at the same time." It was during her early weeks at the gallery that Bo-ra refused, for the first time, to be handled the way Jae-hyun's staff occasionally handled someone they viewed, not unkindly, as an outsider elevated unusually fast through unconventional circumstances. A senior cataloger, skeptical of Bo-ra's rapid hiring, suggested during a team meeting that her contributions be double-checked more thoroughly than the rest of the team's, given her unusual path into the position. "Check my work as thoroughly as you'd check anyone else's," Bo-ra said evenly, refusing to shrink under the implied doubt. "I earned my degree's technical training the same way anyone else here did, even if I didn't finish the diploma. If my actual analysis holds up under scrutiny, the path I took to get here shouldn't matter." Jae-hyun, overhearing from his office doorway, said nothing in the moment, but adjusted the team's review protocols the following week to apply identical scrutiny to every cataloger's work, regardless of tenure. A quiet correction that told Bo-ra, more clearly than any direct defense could have, that he'd actually registered what she'd said. One evening, reviewing a disputed piece's provenance together long after the gallery had closed, Jae-hyun told her something he had never told anyone outside Sung-ho. "I give things away quietly, without expecting anyone to remember, because the one time someone performed loud, visible gratitude for years, it turned out to be theater covering an eventual betrayal," he said. "You never once thanked me loudly for the umbrella, 3 years ago or since. You just kept it, repaired it, and used it to save my life without a second thought about what you might owe me for the original gesture. That's the first genuinely unperformed kindness I've encountered in longer than I can properly measure. I never thought of it as owing anything," Bo-ra said honestly. "It was just kindness, and I held on to it because it mattered to me during a hard week. That's all this ever was, from where I was standing." Cho Young-tae had been Jae-hyun's business partner at the auction house for 15 years, respected within Seoul's art world for his sharp negotiating instincts and his role in several record-setting sales that had cemented the gallery's reputation. He had also, for the last 6 years, been quietly running an extensive forgery operation through the gallery's own authentication and sales pipeline, laundering considerable sums for the organization's less legitimate interests by selling carefully forged works alongside genuine pieces, exploiting gaps in provenance documentation that Young-tae himself had spent years learning to manipulate expertly. The operation had remained undetected for years, until a routine authenticity dispute over a recently sold painting attracted the attention of Seoul's art fraud investigators, whose inquiry, 6 weeks before the alley attack, had begun quietly circling closer to the gallery's authentication records than Young-tae found comfortable. Facing genuine prosecution risk for the first time in 6 years, Young-tae had made a calculated, desperate decision. Rather than risk his own exposure, he would ensure that any evidence investigators eventually found pointed toward Jae-hyun personally, positioning himself as the shocked, betrayed business partner rather than the actual architect of the fraud. A plan that required, as its most immediate step, either discrediting Jae-hyun severely enough to make him an unsympathetic suspect or removing him from the picture entirely before investigators got close enough to distinguish between the partners' actual roles. The hired attacker in the alley had been Young-tae's first, panicked attempt at the latter option. Bo-ra, newly embedded in the gallery's authentication team, had begun noticing things about Young-tae in the weeks following her hiring that unsettled her without yet fully cohering into a clear picture. His unusual defensiveness whenever she raised routine provenance questions about certain pieces, the way he steered conversations away from specific sales records she'd been assigned to catalog, a particular watchful tension in his manner whenever investigators' names came up in gallery discussions. Young-tae seems very uncomfortable whenever the fraud inquiry comes up, she mentioned to Jae-hyun once, cautiously. More than simple professional concern about the gallery's reputation would explain. I don't know your business well enough to say if that's normal or something else. Jae-hyun's expression sharpened. The same careful stillness Bo-ra had learned meant he was calculating something dangerous. Keep noticing, he said quietly. It happened 4 days after Bo-ra first raised her concerns. When Jae-hyun's security team, still investigating the abandoned phone left behind in the alley attack, finally cracked its basic lock screen and found, exactly as they'd hoped, a recent call log and message thread that named the attacker's employer with damning specificity, a contact saved simply as Cho, with messages discussing payment for handling a distraction before the investigators finalized their review. Jae-hyun brought the evidence to Bo-ra that same evening, laying out the full picture that had, until that moment, remained frustratingly incomplete. Young-tae hired the attacker, he said quietly. He's been running the forgery operation this entire time, and now that investigators are closing in, he's trying to either discredit me or remove me before they get close enough to distinguish between us. Bo-ra, staring at the message thread, felt something crystallize with sudden clarity. The umbrella, she said, the night you gave it to me, 3 years ago. What was the date exactly? Do you remember? Jae-hyun checked his own calendar records, cross-referencing against the specific charitable art fund donation he'd made that same rainy week, a donation Young-tae had, Jae-hyun now realized, specifically cited in a provenance document as evidence Jae-hyun had personally authenticated a piece that gallery records showed him nowhere near 3 years earlier on that exact date. That's the date on one of the forged provenance documents, Jae-hyun said slowly, the pieces finally aligning. Young-tae's paperwork claims I personally examined and authenticated a piece that day at the gallery. But I wasn't at the gallery that afternoon. I was near Insadong, in the rain, giving away an umbrella to a stranger whose flooding table I happened to notice. I still have the receipt from the boutique where I bought replacement fabric for the repair. 3 years ago, Bo-ra said, already reaching for her phone to check her own careful, you gave it to me. If I can prove exactly when and where I received it, that corroborates your alibi against Young-tae's forged document. 2 days later, before they could formally present the evidence, Young-tae, sensing the walls closing in from multiple directions at once, made one final desperate move, attempting to intercept and destroy the phone evidence himself, cornering Bo-ra in the gallery's archive room, where she'd been compiling the authentication records that increasingly contradicted his forged provenance claims. Give me what you've found, Young-tae said, low and urgent, blocking her exit. You don't understand what you're interfering with. I understand exactly what I've found, Bo-ra said, backing toward the emergency alarm she'd noted during her very first week. Standard practice for anyone working around valuable, sensitive materials. And I understand you're the reason a man got hired to attack Jae-hyun in an alley, because an umbrella from 3 years ago is about to prove you forged evidence against him. Security arrived within moments, summoned by the alarm she triggered before Young-tae could reach her, subduing him before the confrontation could escalate further. Jae-hyun addressed Young-tae directly the following morning, in front of the gallery's full board and the art fraud investigators who had, by then, been formally briefed on the emerging evidence. 15 years as my partner, Jae-hyun said, laying the evidence across the table with unhurried precision. And for the last 6, you've run a forgery operation through this gallery's authentication pipeline. When investigators got close, you forged a provenance document claiming I personally authenticated a piece on a specific date, a date I can prove through an entirely unrelated, unremembered kindness 3 years ago, that I wasn't even at this gallery. Young-tae's composure cracked. This is circumstantial. An umbrella and a repair receipt prove nothing definitively. They corroborate an alibi that your own forged document accidentally, precisely contradicts, Jae-hyun said. And combined with the message thread on the phone, recovered from the man you hired to attack me in that same alley, the pattern isn't circumstantial anymore. It's simply complete. Bo-ra, present at the investigator's request, laid out her own careful documentation, the repair shop receipt, time-stamped and verified, alongside her own written recollection of the exact rainy afternoon, corroborated by Ariam, who remembered the specific week, clearly given how badly the storm had damaged both their vendor tables that same day. Young Tae's face collapsed entirely, the last of his composure gone. Jae-hyun's justice, when it came, was precise rather than violent. Full cooperation with the art fraud investigation, complete exposure of 6 years of forged provenance documents, and formal removal from every position of trust within the gallery. Leaving Young Tae to face the full weight of the prosecution he had spent weeks desperately trying to redirect toward an innocent man. In the weeks after Young Tae's exposure, something in Jae-hyun's gallery, and in Jae-hyun himself, settled into a shape it hadn't held in years. The board, having watched the entire investigation unfold with growing respect for Bo-ra's contributions, formally offered her a permanent position on the authentication team. Her unconventional path into the role no longer a point of quiet skepticism, but simply, now, an acknowledged part of how she'd earned her place. Jae-hyun, for his part, made a small, personal change that had nothing to do with the investigation's resolution and everything to do with a lesson 3 years and 1 dangerous alley had finally taught him properly. I spent years believing quiet, unremembered kindness was safer than anything performed loudly, because performance always seemed to hide something eventually, he told Bo-ra one evening, the two of them sharing tea in the gallery's now quiet main hall. I still believe that, mostly, but I've realized the point was never really about staying unremembered. It was about the kindness being genuine. Yours was, in both directions, 3 years apart, and I don't think I fully understood how rare that actually is until an umbrella I'd forgotten giving away ended up saving my life. I never thought of it as remarkable, Bo-ra said honestly. It was just an umbrella, and then it was just an instinct in an alley. That's all any of this ever was, from where I was standing. That's not all it was, Jae-hyun said quietly. Not for a long time now, he asked, carefully, whether she would consider staying in his life beyond the gallery's authentication team entirely, something he was still learning how to properly name, having spent years assuming genuine closeness required a performance he'd never quite trusted enough to risk. Bo-ra thought of 3 exhausting years selling watercolors in weather that rarely cooperated, of a single, quietly generous stranger who'd never once expected anything back, and of the strange full-circle moment that had brought them both to exactly this point. I'd like that, she said, on the condition you let me keep the umbrella. It's earned its place by now. Jae-hyun laughed, a real, unguarded sound. Sung-ho, passing the doorway, hadn't heard from him in years. Months later, at a small gallery opening, celebrating Bo-ra's first professionally exhibited watercolor series, funded, at her insistence, entirely through her own earned commission from the authentication work, rather than any direct gift from Jae-hyun, the battered, twice-repaired umbrella sat displayed in a modest frame near the entrance. A small, handwritten card beside it reading simply, "Some kindnesses take 3 years to finish their work. This one still isn't done." If Bo-ra's 3 years of quiet gratitude and Jae-hyun's unremembered kindness moved you the way it moved us, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments, do you believe kindness always comes back around, even years later?